The story begins in the shadowed days of World War II, when Europe was gripped by fear and uncertainty, and the world teetered on the edge of chaos. Across the continent, armies clashed, cities burned, and millions of lives were caught in the whirlwind of history. Yet, even amidst the brutality of battle and the constant threat of defeat, a small group of men prepared to execute a mission so daring, so audacious, it would change the course of the war, and few would ever know it happened. This is the story of the dead man who fooled Hitler. It starts with a man named Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clarke, an intelligence officer who understood that war was not only fought with guns and tanks, but with deception. Clarke had long believed that the mind could be as powerful a weapon as any artillery. He knew that to defeat an enemy like Hitler, one had to think like him, anticipate his fears, and exploit his overconfidence. And so, a plan was born, a plan that relied on illusion, secrecy, and the ultimate gamble, the creation of a completely fake army. The year was 1943, and the Allies were preparing for a decisive campaign to break Hitler's grip on Europe. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was on the horizon, and every detail mattered. Intelligence was everything. One misstep could cost thousands of lives. But Clarke and his team faced a daunting challenge: how to convince the Germans that the Allies were planning to strike somewhere they had no intention of attacking. How could they make an entire army seem real without it actually existing? Enter the man who would become central to the mission, Lieutenant Colonel John Godfrey, a brilliant but unassuming officer whose genius lay not in combat but in cunning. He understood that information could be manipulated as easily as any battlefield maneuver, and so, with meticulous precision, they began constructing a phantom army, the first US Army Group. In the minds of the Germans, this force was massive, well-equipped, and positioned in southeast England, ready to strike at Pas-de-Calais. In reality, it existed only on paper, in maps, in radio transmissions, and in the carefully staged movements of a few vehicles and inflatable tanks. Every element of the deception was crafted to perfection. Dummy landing craft were positioned along the coast. Tanks made of rubber and canvas were set up to cast shadows that could fool enemy reconnaissance. And radio operators sent meticulously crafted messages that made the phantom army seem alive. But the heart of the operation relied on one extraordinary figure, a man who would become the ultimate decoy, a ghost who had to convince Hitler himself that the Allies were preparing for an attack that would never come. This was no ordinary mission. The man chosen for the role was Major William Martin, though in truth he never truly existed. Major Martin was an invention, a composite of carefully selected details pulled from real Allied personnel. His life, career, and reputation were fabricated so convincingly that every intelligence agent who intercepted the information would believe he was real. Clarke and Godfrey knew that if Hitler and his generals were convinced of Martin's existence, they would be forced to divert troops, resources, and attention away from the actual invasion. To achieve this, they went further than most could imagine. Letters were written, personal effects were created, and photographs were staged, all designed to give Major Martin a tangible presence in the eyes of German intelligence. Every report, every detail was calculated to reinforce the illusion. It was a complex dance of deception, requiring absolute precision. One slip, one detail overlooked, and the entire plan could collapse. Lives were at stake, and the success of the Allied invasion depended on it. But the brilliance of the operation lay not only in its ingenuity, but in its audacity. Here was a dead man, a figment of imagination, whose existence could manipulate the strategies of one of history's most ruthless leaders. Hitler, obsessed with intelligence reports and constantly seeking to anticipate Allied moves, was the perfect target. If he believed in the threat posed by this phantom army, he would make decisions that ultimately worked against him, weakening German defences where the real invasion would strike. As the Allies moved closer to the Sicilian coast, the tension grew. The Germans were watching, listening, analysing every piece of intelligence. Meanwhile, the fake army was training. Radio messages crackled across the airwaves, and reports of Major Martin's movements were carefully leaked to enemy agents. Every element had to be convincing, yet subtle. The deception was not only a test of skill and patience, but a high-stakes psychological battle. At the heart of it all, one question loomed. Could the Germans be fooled by something that existed only in imagination? Clarke, and his team had reason to hope they could. Years of careful planning, psychological insight, and sheer audacity had gone into this operation. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the clock was ticking. Soon, the fate of thousands of soldiers, and indeed the course of the war itself, would hinge on the belief in a man who never existed. It was a story of shadows, misdirection, and courage, an invisible war waged not on beaches or battlefields, but in the minds of men. The dead man who fooled Hitler was more than a trick. He was a testament to the extraordinary lengths human ingenuity can go to when lives are on the line, and history itself hangs in the balance. And yet, despite the careful planning, the enormity of the mission weighed heavily on those who carried it out. Every decision mattered. Every false detail, every staged maneuver, could be the difference between victory and disaster. The world would never know the sleepless nights, the endless hours of strategy and fabrication, the painstaking effort to make fiction feel real, but all of that would soon pay off in ways no one could have imagined, and the shadow of Major Martin would loom large over the battlefield, unseen yet devastatingly real to those who believed. The story of this secret mission is a reminder that in war, sometimes the greatest victories are not won by bullets or bombs, but by the quiet, clever maneuvers that turn perception into reality. And so, as the Allies prepared to strike at Sicily, one man, or rather, one illusion stood at the center of a plan so audacious it would become legend. As the days turned into weeks, the first U.S. Army Group, the Phantom Army, began to take on a life of its own. Soldiers who didn't exist were stationed along the English coast, and radio chatter filled the airwaves with carefully scripted reports of training exercises, patrols, and supply movements. Every message was crafted to reinforce the illusion that this was a real, fully operational force. But the genius of the operation was in the details. Inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, and wooden landing craft were placed in fields, along roads, and near ports. From the air, they looked terrifyingly real. German reconnaissance planes flew overhead, and when their pilots reported what they saw, it only added to the illusion. Even Major William Martin's personal life was meticulously constructed. Intelligence officers intercepted letters that seemed to be from his family. Photographs showed him in uniform at various installations, and carefully forged documents recorded his promotions, awards, and assignments. In the eyes of the Germans, Major Martin was as real as any general on the front lines. Clarke and Godfrey had managed to breathe life into a man who had never drawn a single breath. Every detail was designed to be believable, yet impossible to verify, ensuring that even the most suspicious German agents would find it difficult to distinguish truth from fiction. Meanwhile, the Germans were being drawn deeper into the trap. Hitler and his generals, ever paranoid and fixated on the idea of an Allied attack at Pas-de-Calais, took the bait. Reports of troop movements, supply depots, and training exercises reinforced their fears. The Phantom Army was so convincing that German planners allocated divisions to defend against an invasion that would never come. Troops were held back in reserve, supplies were diverted, and attention was focused on the wrong part of Europe entirely. But the operation went beyond mere visual tricks. The Allies exploited every aspect of intelligence gathering to keep the deception alive. Double agents fed false information directly to German intelligence, creating the impression that every Allied move was being carefully monitored. Even the timing of activities was orchestrated to mimic the behavior of a real army preparing for invasion. The Germans, reading every report, listening to every radio and transmission, and following every intercepted order, were unknowingly marching to a rhythm set entirely by Allied strategists. One particularly daring tactic involved fake wireless traffic. Operators created the illusion of radio conversations between units that didn't exist, complete with coded messages and encrypted transmissions. These messages were deliberately designed to be intercepted by German intelligence. The Germans listened, recorded, and analyzed every word, believing that they were gathering critical information about the Allies' next move. In reality, every transmission was a carefully orchestrated lie, designed to reinforce the presence of the first U.S. Army Group. As the weeks passed, the psychological impact on German leadership became evident. Hitler, obsessed with the threat posed by this phantom army, made strategic decisions that would have devastating consequences for his own forces. Divisions that could have reinforced defences in Sicily were instead stationed in northern France, waiting for an invasion that would never happen. Supplies and reinforcements were misallocated, and confidence in their intelligence began to waver. The Germans were trapped, not by guns, not by tanks, but by a ghost. The human element of the operation cannot be overstated. Behind the deception were officers, soldiers, and intelligence agents who had to maintain the illusion at all times. Their work was painstaking, their attention to detail relentless. A misplaced vehicle, a missing radio transmission, or a careless comment could unravel months of planning. And yet, they carried on, understanding that the success of the real invasion depended entirely on their ability to fool an enemy who was trained to see through lies. There were moments of tension and fear. Some agents worried that the Germans might uncover the truth, that their carefully constructed army of shadows might crumble under scrutiny. But Clarke and his team remained confident, knowing that the brilliance of their deception lay in its audacity and its complexity. They were playing a high-stakes game of chess, and every move had to be precise. One false step, and countless lives could be lost. Interestingly, the operation also exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful leaders. Hitler, a man who believed in his own infallibility, was manipulated by reports of a man who never existed. His obsession with intelligence, his paranoia, and his need to anticipate Allied moves worked against him, making him the perfect target for deception. It was a stark reminder that sometimes wars are not won solely on battlefields, but in the minds of those who command armies. By the time the real invasion of Sicily began, the Germans were firmly convinced that the threat lay elsewhere. The fake army had done its job, drawing attention and resources away from the actual target. Allied forces landed with far less resistance than anticipated, taking the Axis powers by surprise. The Phantom Army had succeeded beyond the wildest expectations of its creators, shaping the battlefield long before the first soldier stepped ashore. Even after the invasion, the deception continued to play a crucial role. German forces remained uncertain about the Allies' intentions, reluctant to redeploy troops for fear of another attack from the Phantom Army. Every message, every false report, and every shadow on the landscape contributed to an ongoing strategy of misdirection. The dead man who had fooled Hitler remained, in essence, a spectre haunting the minds of German generals. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this operation is the creativity it demanded. It was a blend of theatre, psychology, and military strategy. Clarke and his team were storytellers, crafting a narrative so convincing that it became reality for those who believed it. They understood human nature, the fears of their enemy, and the power of perception. In many ways, the mission was an art form, a testament to the ingenuity and daring of those who refused to fight by conventional rules alone. As we look back on these events, it's clear that the dead man who fooled Hitler was more than a clever trick. He was a symbol of what can be achieved when courage, intellect, and imagination come together in service of a goal. He reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who fight openly, but also by those who move in the shadows, manipulating perceptions, bending reality, and turning the impossible into truth. And yet, for all its brilliance, the operation remained shrouded in secrecy. Most of the people who witnessed its effects never knew the truth. Major William Martin never set foot on a battlefield. He never fired a shot, never gave a command, and yet his influence on the course of the war was profound. Through him, the Allies achieved something extraordinary. They outwitted one of the most powerful leaders in history, changed the allocation of enemy forces, and ensured the success of a critical campaign, all without a single casualty in the act of deception itself. The story of this mission is a story of ingenuity under pressure, of courage that does not always wear a uniform, and of the extraordinary ways in which ordinary people can shape history. It is a tale of suspense, of risk, and of triumph against all odds, and it sets the stage for the final, breathtaking chapter, when the consequences of this daring deception would become undeniable, and the Phantom Army's role in one of the most pivotal moments of World War II would be forever cemented. The moment of truth arrived with the Allied invasion of Normandy, the operation that would define the final phase of the war in Western Europe. While the Allies struck at the beaches of France, the Germans remained convinced that the real threat was elsewhere at Pas-de-Calais, where Major William Martin's Phantom Army supposedly waited. The brilliance of the deception had reached its zenith. Hitler's forces were divided, misallocated, and paralyzed by doubt, all because of a man who had never lived. Across northern France, German commanders hesitated, reluctant to move their troops from the supposedly endangered region. Divisions that could have reinforced the front lines in Normandy were kept on standby, tied up by fear of an attack that would never come. Every hour, every day that German forces remained in place, the Allies gained ground. The Phantom Army's unseen presence shaped decisions at the highest levels of the Nazi command, turning imagined threats into real strategic advantages. Meanwhile, the architects of the deception watched from the shadows, aware of the magnitude of what they had achieved. Clarke, Godfrey, and their colleagues had pulled off a feat of unparalleled ingenuity. It was not just a trick, it was a decisive action that saved countless lives. Thousands of soldiers who might have faced overwhelming opposition landed on beaches less defended than expected. The operation demonstrated that in war, intelligence, creativity, and cunning could sometimes outweigh brute force. Even Hitler himself was ensnared by the illusion. He remained convinced that the Allies' main attack would strike Pas-de-Calais, convinced by the fabricated reports, the intercepted communications, and the carefully staged presence of a man who never existed. The very leader who had orchestrated some of the most ruthless campaigns in history was outwitted by deception, manipulated by shadows, and forced to react to threats that were pure fiction. The story of Major William Martin is a story of meticulous planning, meeting perfect timing. Every detail, from the rubber tanks to the forged letters, played a part in shaping the outcome. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, where the power of belief proved stronger than armies, stronger than fortifications, stronger than the odds stacked against the Allies. The dead man had become a weapon, invisible yet lethal in his effect, a testament to the extraordinary human capacity for ingenuity in moments of crisis. As the invasion progressed, the impact of the deception became undeniable. Allied forces broke through German lines with greater speed and efficiency than had been anticipated. The misallocation of German forces allowed the Allies to consolidate their foothold in France, securing supply lines and advancing inland. Every false report, every shadow of a tank, every fictitious order issued by Major Martin had contributed to the success of the campaign. History was being shaped not only by courage in battle but by imagination, strategy, and the audacity to deceive. In the aftermath, when soldiers and historians would piece together the events of the war, the role of the Phantom Army remained largely unknown. Major William Martin never appeared in history books in the traditional sense, yet his influence was profound. He had changed the course of the war without ever firing a shot, without ever giving a command, and without ever existing. The operation became a legend among intelligence officers, a story told in whispers of daring, creativity, and brilliance that had outsmarted one of the most powerful leaders of the 20th century. Reflecting on this mission, one cannot help but marvel at the audacity of it all. The creation of a fictional man, the orchestration of an entire army that existed only in illusion, and the ability to manipulate an enemy as formidable as Hitler. These were feats that required courage, precision, and imagination beyond the ordinary. It reminds us that in moments of great challenge, the human mind can find extraordinary solutions, bending reality in ways that seem impossible yet can change the world. The dead man who fooled Hitler is a story of shadows shaping history, of invisible hands guiding the course of events, and of courage that manifests not in guns and explosions, but in intellect, creativity, and nerve. It is a tale of triumph that proves that even in the darkest hours, ingenuity and daring can illuminate the path to victory. And in the quiet moments that followed the liberation of Europe, as soldiers returned home and the world sought to rebuild, the true magnitude of the deception remained hidden. Major William Martin's existence was a secret known only to those who had orchestrated it, yet the impact of his phantom presence was tangible, undeniable, and permanent. Through him, history itself had been nudged in a direction that would alter the lives of millions and hasten the end of a devastating war. This operation reminds us that heroism takes many forms. It is not always marked by medals or ceremonies. Sometimes it is measured by the ripple effects of ideas, strategies, and courage executed in silence. The dead man who fooled Hitler remains one of the most remarkable examples of human ingenuity in warfare, a testament to the power of imagination and a story that continues to inspire awe decades later. In the end, it was a story of extraordinary minds meeting extraordinary circumstances, where perception became reality and fiction shaped the outcome of history. A man who never lived, an army that never existed, and yet, through the brilliance of those who dared to deceive, the tide of war was changed. And that is why the story of the dead man who fooled Hitler will never be forgotten, a legend not of combat, but of cunning, courage, and the astonishing power of a well-crafted illusion.